It was the eagles. I knew that eagles always follow along a stream, or make for an opening in the mountains, and I followed the direction they took, with the result that I discovered, and I think very appropriately named, Eagle Pass.
That man was Walter Moberly. He was a surveyor, and his wildest dream had just come true. He had discovered a pass through one of the mountain barriers of British Columbia. He named it Eagle Pass, but that was 2 years before Confederation. And an all-Canadian railway to the Pacific was as much of a dream as a Dominion of Canada itself. And yet, in 20 years, men would drive the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway almost on the very spot where Moberly stood. So that's where it all began, and that's where it will end. The story of the building of the railway they said was impossible, and the story of the building of the nation of Canada along the way. The 19th century, the age of the railway. February 15th, 1871. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the Governor General was in the Senate concluding the speech from the throne, the first official declaration that Canada would build a railway to the Pacific. This was John A. Macdonald's way of luring British Columbia into Confederation and of keeping American railways and settlement out of the Canadian Northwest.
How many of us are there in the Northwest?
Whole railway policy is preposterous. Look, here we are, a country barely 4 years old, inexperienced, far from wealthy. Yet he has determined to build a railroad 1,000 miles longer than America's Union Pacific.
And they knew where they were going. We don't even have adequate maps of our Pacific coast. The only destination the railroad can aim for is an island across the Straits of Georgia.
Oh, Mr. Mackenzie.
Mackenzie?
Chapa? Poe? Not right?
Gentlemen.
Johnny in form, I see.
And after that, I'm sure the poor lass was forced to go back to her mother. Donald Smith, welcome to the House and congratulations on your stunning victory in Manitoba.
Thank you, Macdonald. You are more than gracious.
Ah, Huntington.
Mackenzie, what do you think of their proposal?
This railroad is insane, Huntington.
But they will get their bill through.
Oh, yes, to be sure, Blake. No doubt they'll get it through the House. But how do they propose to build this railroad?
They'll build it by tearing themselves down, brick by brick.
So, it will bring them down. And Sir John. But in the process, they will take the country down with them.
Cheer up, Topper. We've got the majority.
What Mackenzie and his gritstone knows that we found a British Columbian surveyor to get us through the mountains. Oddly enough, an old friend of my wife's. Claims he's found a new pass.
I'm delighted, Mr. Moberly, delighted. Are you sure you can get the railroad through those mountains?
Prime Minister, I can promise you more than a mere route from the prairies to the Pacific. I promise you can commence construction of the line 6 weeks after I get back to British Columbia.
Oh, you should not make such promises before witnesses, Mr. Moberly. I'm bound to believe you.
Sir, I intend you to.
Of course, I don't know how many millions you have. It's going to cost you money getting through those canyons.
Did the Eagles really lead you to the discovery of this pass?
No, yes.
The road is going to be built and proceeded with vigorously, continuously, systematically, and successfully to a completion, and the fate of Canada as a dominion then will be sealed.
The national dream of John A. Macdonald, to bind together a dominion sea to sea by building an iron link to the Pacific. The railway would fill the prairies with Canadian settlers and preserve the unity of British North America.
A British subject, I was born. A British subject, I will die.
If Americans reached the Northwest first, Canada would falter.
Then we should fall, helpless, powerless, aimless, into the hands of the neighboring republic. No, I will not have it.
The only way was the Pacific Railway for the making of a nation. But in 1871, the Canadian nation wasn't much more than a cluster of rough-hewn eastern communities huddled on the edges of the vast Laurentian Shield. In those years after Confederation, 3/4 of the population lived in isolated farms. It was a hard, often dismal existence. Ontario had already run out of arable land, but where was anyone to go? In all of Canada, there was scarcely a city worthy of the name metropolis. Young men were looking for new frontiers, but the only one available lay south of the Great Lakes. The American West was opening up. In fact, by 1871, 1/4 of all Canadians in North America were living south of the border. The Pacific Railway would open the Canadian frontier, but the line's destination was almost a continent away. The fiercely British colony at Victoria, with its pretty English gardens and its stately rituals of tea time and tiffin, and its new bargain, a railway for Confederation. In the BC mountains, there were only the scattered gold mines, such as the wide-open camps of the Caribou. The prairie land was Canada's in name only. In reality, it still belonged to the buffalo hunters of the plains, the Cree and the Blackfoot, and the Métis. The first Métis uprising under Louis Riel had been over for 2 years. But it would be another 2 years before the end of the whiskey traders. those pockets of the American Wild West that would soon be brought under control by the Northwest Mounted Police. Hudson's Bay Company trappers and traders still operated along the forested river valleys to the north. Canada had taken over the company's vast land holdings in the Northwest, but the only real settlement on the plains was the little band of Selkirk farmers along the Red River. Problem was that they were almost totally cut off from civilization. The Laurentian Shield, 700 miles of granite wasteland blocking the way to the west. The prairie itself, little more than a desert. And the worst was still to come. Wall after wall of mountain barriers would cost millions of dollars and hundreds of lives. To build the impossible railway. That was the monumental task that Johnny Macdonald was asking of his fledgling nation. To him and to his Quebec lieutenant, George Etienne Cartier, the Pacific Railway was the only salvation of Canada and of the Conservative Party. The Tories were at a low ebb. The Prime Minister couldn't expect to stay in power without some magnificent accomplishment, and a transcontinental railway would fill the bill. He already had some of the men to build it, men such as the government's engineer-in-chief Sanford Fleming. But Eastern taxpayers shuddered at the thought of what it would all cost. And so did the cautious, frugal, liberal leader, Alexander Mackenzie.
It wouldn't be necessary to construct the greater portion of the line for another 30 years.
Aye, I said, but without a railway to the Pacific, there won't be a Canadian nation for 30 years. You know, I've even heard it said by Americans, and not just on the street, but in the official milieu as well, that Canada should not exist. That our existence contravenes the Monroe Doctrine. All right, go ahead and laugh, the both of you. Right into the lion's jaws.
Yes, Margaret.
Excuse me, ma'am. She's down, Sir John.
Thank you, Margaret. You will excuse me. And so we must take vigorous and immediate action to counteract them. That's what this railroad's all about, you know. Or a good deal of what it's all about. Show them, unmistakably, our absolute resolve to tie the West to the East with this railroad. And then they won't dare to interfere with us. Goodbye, dear. And you too, Fleming. Oh, always a delight to see you.
Goodbye, dear.
You know Walter Moberly, do you not?
Yes.
Well, I want to put him in touch with you. He's actually found a way through the mountains, and I have a feeling you'll both end up working on the railroad.
Well, I hope so. Good day to you.
Get Agnes to tell you Moberly's story about the Eagles. It's a fascinating story. Goodbye.
Agnes Macdonald's husband had not had an easy life. His first wife and their infant son, both dead, and now a 2-year-old daughter impaired physically and mentally.
Shall we go and sit down a wee bit? Come on.
Has there been any improvement in her condition?
No, not really. We're quite reconciled to it. It's taken us all this while, but now we are. John always likes to spend a moment with her before he leaves the house. She'll be delighted today. He's so rarely home for lunch. She has you to thank for that.
back, bring back. Oh, bring back my Bonnie to me, to me. Bring back, bring back. Oh, bring back my Bonnie to me. Hey. And if you're a good girl, I'll bring you a grit home for supper.
John A. Macdonald was 56 years old. He'd managed to stay off the bottle ever since his marriage to Agnes. But now, to survive politically, he'd had to propose this impossible railway.
All right, away we go.
Without it, there could hardly be a nation of Canada. By the summer of 1871, the railway was official. Parliament had approved the bargain with British Columbia. All during that debate, John A. Macdonald had been away in Washington, fighting the battle of Canada's rights and losing, fighting with Britain, fighting with the United States. But now he was back in Ottawa, determined to get the railway going. And so the Canadian Pacific surveys began. Walter Moberly was soon on his way from Ottawa to British Columbia to take charge of the surveys there. It would take him almost 2 weeks just to get to Victoria. First, he had to travel to Chicago on the Grand Trunk, which would one day be the Canadian Pacific's bitter rival, and then by way of the Union Pacific to Utah, and then from Utah to San Francisco on the Central Pacific. With a Central Pacific steamer to take him up the coast to Victoria. The eve of Moberly's departure for the interior was also the eve of BC's Confederation, July 19th, 1871. Moberly sent out his survey crews, and then he followed a long roundabout trail inland to rendezvous with Party S, heading for the Rockies. Altogether that summer, there were 21 of these parties dispatched into the Canadian wilderness. More than 800 men who would starve and freeze and sicken and sometimes die in the unexplored crannies of the new Canada, all trying to chart a route for the Pacific Railway. Many of the surveyors kept personal records of both the hardships and the beauties that they experienced. One of these diarists was in the crew that Moberly was headed for, a young horse wrangler named Robert Rylett.
Now we gaze upon a solemn and, save to the strong-winged eagle, a silent and inaccessible scene of grandeur. Mighty mountains towering upwards, their peaks almost lost in the blue of the sky, their bases buried in gloom, their sides rent and worn by nature's convulsions, and the mad streams ever leaping in foam and tumult from their snowy starting points, forming barriers in the way of puny man as he threads his way through the chaos of the lower levels amid difficulty and danger.
Walter Moberly was a fighter. He came from fighting stock. He was half Polish with military men on both sides of his family. He had a legendary staying power. He was a great dancer. He could dance all night. He could sing and drink all night, but the next day he could face anything that might come his way. In short, he was a character. Egotistical, impulsive, stubborn, independent of spirit. Moberly would do anything to have the great railway follow his route, the route that had been developing in his mind for years. This is what Moberly and the railway faced. 3 sets of mountains barring the way to the coast. There was the Rocky Mountains, and then there were the Selkirk Mountains, and finally to the west, the Gold Range, later known as the Monashee Mountains. Now, to get to the Pacific, the railway would either have to go through these mountains or around them. There were several known passes in the Rockies. There was the Yellowhead Pass up here, the traditional route of the fur traders. And then there was the Howes Pass to the south. As far as anybody knew, there was no pass in the Selkirks. But Moberly himself had discovered the Eagle Pass in the Gold Range. So Moberly's idea was that the railroad would go through the Howes Pass, circumnavigate the Selkirks by the valley of the Columbia, and then head off through the Gold Range and Eagle Pass down the Fraser Canyon to the Pacific. Now Moberly had caught up with one of his survey crews heading for the Howes Pass. It had taken 3 incredible months just to reach the Rockies from the Pacific, because, you see, not 1 foot of survey could be taken until pack trails were hacked out of the wilderness in order to bring in supplies for those fierce mountain winters. This survey party, Party S, was led by an American named E.C. Gillette. He was a good surveyor, but he was a bad leader. And the supplies and the animals were in the care of our diarist, Robert Rylott, a Crimean veteran formerly with the Royal Engineers. Rylott's wife was a hopeless invalid, and if he had not been desperate for money to pay the medical bills, he would certainly never have left her in New Westminster. But here he was, walled off by a 500-mile barrier of mountain and forest that few men would dare to penetrate alone.
Come on, Gillette, give us a hand with these horses. They're your horses, Rylott. Yeah, well, they're carrying your food. Oh. Help Mr. Rylott. I'm going back to see what's happening with the other men. You bastard!
Moberly and his men set up a base camp at the foot of Howes Pass. It was a desolate sight where the Blaeberry River tumbled down the western slope of the Rockies. This was to be the surveyor's home for almost 2 years.
I want to go back, Mr. Moberly.
I can't let you.
It's not fair. My wife will die and I won't be there. What the hell use is this bloody railway anyway? Who wants to come here? What a ghastly, ghastly place. Not as if there were people over the next hill, or even the one beyond that. God knows how far we are from everyone and everything. And with no one but convicts and hooligans for companions.
Convicts are practically the only men we can get to come here.
I came.
So did I.
Moberly wasn't going to stay here on the Blaeberry all winter, but he did want to get his men started on an exploratory survey of the Howes Pass. That meant checking the altitudes with an aneroid barometer and looking over the land with a practiced eye, trying to see the finished line of railway with all the trestles and the bridges and the tunnels and the grades and the curves. If that route proved feasible, then they would go on to make a locating survey. That meant chain men marking out the whole route in 100-foot sections, transit men checking the angles of each bend, rodmen and levelers working out the precise altitudes and inscribing them on benchmarks at half-mile intervals. But in the fall of 1871, there wasn't going to be much time for any kind of survey. The work had hardly begun when the snow came. Melted snow filled the instruments and made the rocks too slippery for footing, and there was only one thing to do, and that was to withdraw to the base camp and sit out the winter. On December 4th, 1871, Walter Moberly took his Indians and set off as casually as if he were on a pleasant Sunday hike. He was heading for New Westminster, a distance of more than 400 miles. Here in the Selkirks, Moberly made a brief search for a pass, hoping to shorten the route he'd proposed for the railway. But in those mysterious mountains, all he found was snow, an incredible, terrifying world of snow. Moberly made it through that empty, frozen jungle. And in Victoria, he immediately launched his preparations for the following season. He was determined to make a full, detailed locating survey of Howe's Pass, with or without authority from Ottawa. Absolutely confident that his route was the only route worth considering. But as it turned out, Walter Moberly was wrong. That next year, 1872, there were tremendous pressures on Johnny Macdonald. He had an election coming up, and he had no one who would undertake his great railway project. And also there was deep concern over Cartier.
You are ill, aren't you? What are you doing this evening? Come out to the house, have supper. Treat Agnes and Mary to some of those crazy French songs of yours. You haven't done that for years.
You haven't broken out yourself for years.
For a very good reason, I'm a very happy man. I love this place, but I'm never sorry to leave it after the session is finished. It's sort of like getting out of school.
And so the politicians departed Parliament Hill to fight their election campaign, leaving behind the man in charge of finding a route for the railway, Walter Moberly's boss, Sanford Fleming. He was engineer-in-chief for the Pacific Railway and also for the government's intercolonial line to the Maritimes. And he had solid qualifications for both those jobs. Back in 1862, he'd drawn up a detailed plan for building a railway to the Pacific, right down to the last horse, cross-tie, and telegraph pole, and of course to the last dollar. He'd figured out with remarkable accuracy that the project would cost $100 million, and he'd calculated it would take 25 years to complete. Now he was faced with Ottawa's promise to British Columbia to finish the line in only 10 years. Fleming was 45, with half his life still ahead, in which to complete the intercolonial, plan the Canadian Pacific and the Pacific Cable, devise a workable system of standard time, publish a book of short daily prayers for busy households, girdle the globe, and cross Canada by foot, snowshoe, dog team, horseback, raft, canoe, and finally by rail. He was ready to leave on his first western journey by July 1872. He set off with a party of gentlemen travelers to trace the railway's proposed route all the way from Lake Superior to the Pacific. They left their lake steamer at Thunder Bay and began to cross the Great Barrier of the Laurentian Shield. This was the only way of getting west without leaving Canada. Fleming and his party were headed west along what was known as the Dawson Route, named after a surveyor, Simon J. Dawson, who laid it out. It was a pretty bad route, a series of corduroy roads connecting a chain of lakes, and that had been trampled badly by the soldiers who went out to quell the Riel Uprising in 1869. In spite of that, however, this was the only way that you could get to the Canadian Northwest without going through the United States. By 1873, about 1,000 settlers came over this Dawson Route on their way to Winnipeg, most of them in a state of semi-starvation. They had to catch their own fish to eat. Their gear was ruined by the water in the leaky boats. They were forced, many of them, to work their own passage. They had to sleep in dirty, neglected shacks, and all of them would be subjected to the vicious abuse and threats of the employees of the contractors who were supposed to be keeping the route up, but weren't. In 1872, Fleming and his party negotiated the Dawson Route in relative comfort. It took them less than 2 weeks. And then they faced the country that everybody was talking about, the romantic Northwest, the subject of one of the most popular new books in Canada, William Francis Butler's The Great Lone Land.
No ocean in the world can vie with its gorgeous sunsets. No solitude can equal the loneliness of a night-shrouded prairie. This ocean has no past, time has been naught to it, and men have come and gone, leaving behind them no track, no vestige of their presence.
But men would come and leave a track, if they could. Now the road led on towards Fort Garry and the little settlement at Selkirk, where the feast days were Scottish, the worship was Scottish, and the chief mode of transportation had a Scottish ancestor. The Red River cart. Scrub oak, shaganappy, and squeals, that's what they called it. A wooden box built on 2 wheels without a single nail, held together by tough strands of buffalo hide, shaganappy. They couldn't grease the axles because the thick prairie dust would clog the works. thus the squeals. They traveled in brigades, and because the carts left deep ruts in the prairie sod, they were spread out as many as 20 carts wide. And that explains why the streets of some of the pioneer prairie villages were so broad. Fleming took 6 of these carts and 2 buckboards and set out across the prairie, traveling northwest along the old Carleton Trail. That led through the forested valley of the North Saskatchewan River and then on to the Yellowhead Pass in the Rockies near Jasper House. Months before he'd left the east, Fleming had decided that the railway too would take this northern route through the Yellowhead, and he had been totally unaware of Walter Moberly's unauthorized activities, all of which centered on a more southerly route. And news of this change reached Moberly in the spring, just 4 hours before he was to leave Victoria, and he was devastated.
What do you want, Gillette? You got something, eh? What do you want?
There was nothing Moberly could do but abandon all his supplies and move his quarreling men north. At Howe's Pass, he found poor Robert Rylott desperate for news of his invalid wife. After a long winter's pent-up isolation on the Blaeberry in the middle of nowhere, tempers were short. Rylott could see his companions only as an evil-tempered, inhuman mob.
Like what, Rylott?
Rylott! Jesus, what am I supposed to do? Gillette, get out of there! Get him out of there! You stupid bloody fools! You stupid fools everywhere! Now look, don't explain yourself. That's the last thing of anything I want to hear. Mr. Moberly, you must let me explain. Now, this has been a terrible winter here. Put it out of your head, Mr. Rylott. Put this whole place out of your head. You're leaving it. Mr. Fleming, our father in the east, is most anxious to have us meet him all at the Yellowhead. The Yellowhead? Now, you can't mean all of us. All of us. You, me, that maniac over there, 10,000 of us. New supplies. Over the mountain, pack up and go, just like that. That's what I want to know about, Mr. Rylott. How are we going to do it, eh? Stinking tourist Fleming decides to ferry-foot it out here for a little camping trip in the mountains and expects us to be ready for him. In the nicest possible way, of course, with little tea trays of welcome, no doubt, to be bloody towing out of the mountains. Because he has decided that my route, the route I have proved, is impracticable. I thought you and he were friends. I thought he respected your judgment. Mr. Rylott, Mr. Fleming and I are such friends, as you would have it called, that I am taking your friend Mr. Gillette and his revolver to make my opening remarks to Mr. Fleming perfectly clear.
It's a good thing you could get here on a Sunday, Moberly. Gives us a chance to talk with a little privacy.
Yes. I haven't had a Sunday you could call a Sunday since a year ago. No longer.
I'm sorry to hear you say so. You really should do better than that for yourself, Moberly. And the Reverend Dr. Grant, of course, has insisted that Sunday is treated as Sunday ever since we set out. We've not lingered on the way, mind you, but, well, having a minister by, the Lord will surely be close at hand.
Mr. Fleming.
A rather formal address, is it not, between two old friends?
I don't feel friendly.
I'm sorry.
Your instructions have so completely staggered me.
I had to stop you. Your direction was so far from where we were heading.
You made an arbitrary decision.
Arbitrary. Affecting a whole year of my surveys.
But based upon years of my having studied the problem. You talk as if my decision was an irresponsible whim.
It is a whim. You don't know these mountains. I have lived here. I have climbed them. I have traveled through them in all seasons. You don't know anything about them. How can you possibly make a decision based on little bits of paper?
Done the right thing. I know it.
It's absolutely incomprehensible. If the line comes this far north, every potential customer the railway has will send his business south, to the Americans. And what about me? What about all the work I've done? The men I already had in the field, what about them? What about the supplies?
Wasted, Mr. Moberly. But not in my service. You may recall, I did not authorize a location survey in Howe's Pass.
No. Your telegram indicated
My telegram simply authorized the running of a trial line, a minimal survey. And yet you saw fit to spend $7,000 on supplies which are now quite useless. They'll have to be abandoned. It was a wanton waste,
I can
Mr.
prove
Moberly.
Howe's Pass is the best route.
And why did you need 400 horses? Besides which, the pace of your survey has been abominably slow. You've fallen behind with everything you were required to do. You should really be relieved of your duties, but I cannot afford to stop the survey. You will proceed immediately to complete all work on the line this season.
You put me in an impossible situation. But you will not make me desert my men. You will not make me resign the service, Mr. Fleming.
This is the pass in the Rockies that the CPR never did get to use, the Yellowhead. Fleming left here, made his way down to the coast, and eventually got back to Ottawa using American railroads. And he did everything he could to force Moberly's resignation, short of firing him. He countermanded his orders in the field to his own survey crews. He appointed a new boss for Moberly in British Columbia. But Moberly would not quit. He hung on for more than a year, and when he finally did give up and go back to Ottawa, he was faced with one final humiliation. Fleming would not pass his expense accounts. He ordered them audited, and then he asked for them to be audited a second time. In the end, poor Moberly had to borrow money just to pay his room and board in Ottawa. For all of his life, he never ceased to complain about the treatment he'd received. And he never lost his bitterness over the Yellowhead decision. In Ottawa, the whole railway project had suddenly been plunged into confusion. The Prime Minister had won his election, but the Liberal opposition was crying foul, and they were beginning to ask all the wrong questions. But over in John A. Macdonald's riverside residence, there was only a troubled silence.
Well, then.
Mr. Fleming, it has been such a very long time. And good of you to come.
And good of you to go to so much trouble. But I'm afraid I haven't come for tea. We seem to be alone.
Yes, we are alone.
Ah. You're not well, I take it.
That's right. Do sit down, Mr. Fleming. I'm sure you're not going to refuse a cup of tea now you're here.
Certainly, certainly.
Silly how one can let an insignificant thing like a cold get one down. But I suppose we're all vulnerable to these things.
Yes, yes, of course, of course. Thank you.
He's, asked you to pass your business on to me. I hope you don't mind.
Well, I'd be a fool if I did. I'd miss this.
You're very kind.
I have been having the most outrageous time. All to do with the survey, and how very badly it's gone. Oh, it's been so slow. Oh, my dear, that fellow Moberly.
Walter Moberly? Why, he's a dear man.
Dear he may be, if you mean expensive. A more thoroughly exasperating man cannot exist on the face of the earth.
Oh, I am sorry to hear that. Oh, Mr. Fleming, I can see no value in us pursuing this charade. Surely you've heard the rumors, read the press.
A word here and there. I set no store by rumors.
This is more than rumor, Mr. Fleming. He thinks they mean to bring the railway down by some incomprehensible intrigue and scandal.
But you don't believe that he's involved?
Of course I don't believe that. Of course I don't. But I don't know anything. I know nothing.
John A. Macdonald's national dream had become a political nightmare.
It fairly staggered me. It was one of those overwhelming misfortunes that they say every man must meet once in his life.
John A. Macdonald was in grave trouble because all the time the surveyors were facing their terrible ordeals in the wilderness, and Sanford Fleming was coping with the route for a Pacific railway, events were piling up in Ottawa. A terrifying scandal was brewing. If it broke out, it would threaten the career of the Prime Minister, the future of his party, and the very existence of a Pacific Railroad. It was a time of shattered dreams. By the spring of 1873, Robert Rylott had finally finished his 2-year stint with the survey, only to learn at last that his wife was dead. Now, with a companion, he was on his way home. And here, about 150 miles north of Kamloops, they were out of sugar, almost out of matches, and down to their last sack of flour.
We fell to cogitating on the possibilities and probabilities of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And in the mind's eye, we pictured a train of cars sweeping along over this flat, over the fierce streams we passed, puffing and snorting up the mountainsides in gentle curves and windings, shrieking wildly as some denizen of the forest, scared at the strange monster of fire and smoke, hurries off at greater speed as the shrill whistle reaches it.
To the dispirited Rylott and his hungry companion, the Pacific Railway was still only an illusion. They had no idea how right they were. Away beyond the mountains to the east, John A. Macdonald's own dream was falling apart as Ottawa prepared for the greatest political upheaval in Canada's history.